Part 27. I Can See the Laws of Things. Author, Yitiao Xianyue. Chapter 261. Lin An looked down at them and said indifferently, I don't care whether you are truly loyal to me or just pretending to be so. From now on, my orders are your will. I have issued a statement to the world. My first task for you is to eliminate the regimes of all countries that have not issued a statement and take over them one day later. Do you understand? As soon as these words came out, the dozen world-class strongmen instantly felt a wave of trembling and fear. Yes. Master. They must accept it, and they have to accept it. And the next moment, Lin An turned around suddenly, his eyes were indifferent. Wind, water, thunder, and lightning, earth, listen to my orders. In an instant, one roulette wheel of rules spread out from his eye of law. The moment he said that, the dozen world-class gods of law were horrified to see countless sea water surging up, turning into giants of water elements one after another, roaring to the sky. The storm was gathering, and one huge tornado after another appeared outside the coastline of all countries in the world, and people were trembling. Thunder and lightning surged in the sky, and the whole world was shrouded in rolling dark clouds at that moment. Thunder clouds filled the sky of the world. And on the land controlled by one country after another, outside one city after another, the earth rolled up. They continued to gather, and finally formed one after another earth element puppets tens of meters high. The whole world, all the countries, were surrounded by these four elements. At this moment, all the countries in the world who wanted to challenge Lin An's authority booed at this moment. The dozen world-class powerhouses looked at the scene tremblingly. At this moment, they really had a real understanding of Lin An. God. At this moment, he was really a god. No one could cast a spell on the whole world on a large scale. At this moment, they really knew the gap between themselves and Lin An. This is a natural chasm. Yes. Master, the dozen world-class powerhouses knelt again and said. We will definitely complete the task you assigned to us. One day later, all those who have not issued a statement will die. They really surrendered this time. Surrender to Lin An's powerful strength. As long as Lin An still has such power, they will never betray. Lin An said nothing, turned around, tore the space, and his body disappeared instantly. Above the eastern sea of Zhuzhou, Chen Daoming, with white hair, stood with his hands behind his back. Although Zhuzhou was not interfered by the four elements, with his powerful induction, he already knew what was happening all over the world at this moment. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and said, Lin An, what do you want to do? Do you really want to be a tyrant? Just as he finished speaking, the space not far from him tore open. A voice came from the space tunnel. No, I don't have that plan. Chen Daoming turned around and looked at Lin An, who suddenly appeared in front of him. Lin An gave him a completely different feeling now. He couldn't tell. At this moment, he couldn't feel the breath of Lin An at all, as if he had merged with everything around him. Chen Daoming frowned and said, Lin An, what's wrong with you? Lin An slowly closed his eyes, and the power of collapse in his right eye slowly disappeared into the depths of his pupil, and the light of the law in his left eye slowly dissipated. At that moment, the breath of the heavenly Dao on him disappeared without a trace. When he opened his eyes again, the whole person had changed back to his previous appearance. Lin An slowly said, Don't worry, when I was fighting with Kaidi before, I realized this state. In this state, I can integrate with the laws of all things and make them truly a part of myself. Lin An stretched out his hand, stroked his eyes, and said, Human nature will inevitably be affected, but it's okay. I now have a way to control that power. After entering this heavenly Dao state, his emotions will indeed become very weak, cold, and ruthless. But in this state, he is truly invincible. And as long as he exits the state, he can recover everything he should have as a human being. Chen Daoming looked at him deeply and said, Lin, that is to say, the dangerous statement you just issued to the whole world came from you in that state? That is not your real idea, right? Lin looked at the sea and said, no, that is what I mean. Humanity must be unified in the shortest time, and using force is the fastest and most effective way. Chen Daoming looked at him with a complicated look and said, but this is not real rule, but violence. Lin turned his head and looked at him, saying, I have no intention of ruling them, but sometimes, humans must have a powerful centralized ruler to unify and mobilize the world's resources. Otherwise, when the giant crocodiles of the old era fully recover, then what they lose is not freedom, but life. Chen Daoming frowned suddenly and said, Lin, do you know something? Lin An looked into the distance expressionlessly and said, this world is far beyond our imagination, Chen Daoming. We only know that there was an age of immortals before our time, but what about the years before the immortals? At that time, what kind of creatures ruled our world? We don't know anything. Chen Daoming is such a smart person. In an instant, he heard a lot of information from Lin An's words. Chen Daoming said deeply, you mean, in the old times, there were creatures that lived to our time. The wind blew through Lin An's long hair. Lin An said expressionlessly, the higher you stand, the more you can see. I have something I want to see with you. I hope you are ready. Chen Dao frowned and said, what? The next moment, Lin An stretched out his hand, and a faint light flashed on his fingers. In an instant, the space twisted. The next moment, right in front of them, a piece of black flesh that was twisting and struggling appeared. Chen Daoming's face changed drastically. The piece of flesh and blood kept struggling to stretch out its limbs, and kept screaming. It was covered with scarlet blood and eyeballs. Chen Daoming only took a look at the thing, and immediately felt an extremely cold breath. That kind of coldness seemed to take your soul into the abyss, making you lose all your emotions and immersing you forever in an icy pond. What is this? Chen Daoming subconsciously took a step back, and his voice was trembling. I can see the laws of things. Author, Yi Tiao Xian Yue. Chapter 262. Lin An looked at the flesh and blood and said, the flesh and blood of the old god. It is also the parasite I found from Kai Di's body. This piece of flesh and blood turned Kai Di into a huge and twisted monster. He revealed to me a signal that concerns the fate of our entire humanity. Lin An suddenly raised his head and said, the ruler of the old era is coming back. And it was at the moment when he said those words. The piece of flesh and blood that was constantly struggling suddenly stopped twisting and struggling. All the eyeballs above focused their attention on Lin at the same time. He looked at Lin across the void. It was as if something was peering at them from another space through these eyeballs. There was a click. Lin An waved his hand, and all the eyeballs on the piece of flesh exploded at that moment. Lin said expressionlessly, after killing Kai Di, I captured his soul and wanted to investigate all the information about this thing. We may be able to find the answer from his soul. Chen Daoming took a deep breath, but it was still difficult to erase the trembling in his heart. The moment those eyeballs swept across his body, he felt as if everything about him was going to be swallowed up by those eyeballs. Even in his mind, at that moment, he remembered countless hoarse whispers. Make his soul tremble. He had already felt it, it must have happened just now. The feeling of being watched made him tremble all over. Even in the realm of demigods, it is difficult to give him a sense of security. If this kind of thing really appeared in the world, he couldn't imagine what would happen. Maybe. Lin is right. Humanity may really have to face a truly terrifying enemy. At this time, if there is no powerful centralizer to mobilize the resources of all mankind, the consequences. Unthinkable. And at the next moment, Lin waved his hand. Chen Daoming immediately saw a blue light group appear in front of them. His pupils shrank. Soul. He is no stranger to souls, because he has kept the unicorn jade heart he gave Lin An for more than 10 years. He grew up step by step through killing. Lin An said indifferently, "This is Kaidi's soul, but he has been erased by me. Now in this soul are all his memories. He is the only one who has been in contact with that kind of thing so far and still maintains his self. We may be able to find information about that kind of thing from his memory. I made some subtle modifications to the soul so that we can be in his memory space instead of simply seeing his subjective perspective." Chen Daoming took a deep breath and said, "You want me to have a look with you?" Lin An nodded and said, "Yes, if that kind of thing really happens, I need you to help me stabilize human society so that I can let go and fight. If a rebellion breaks out in human society while I am fighting, we will fall into passivity. Human beings are best at dismantling their own order from within." Chen Daoming frowned and said, "Okay, I promise you." The next moment, the two people closed their eyes. Now they are all extraordinary people who have entered the world. They easily peeled off their consciousness and threw themselves into the void soul. The next moment, their consciousnesses materialized, and their eyes opened in their souls. They found themselves standing on the high seas, and in the distance, Kai Di was roaring to fight against Lin in his memory. Lin An turned his head, looked around, and said, "This time should have been a few days ago. We should move the time forward a little bit." Lin stretched out his hand and moved his fingers gently. In an instant, everything around him flashed by like a videotape being played backwards. Time keeps going backwards. In an instant, decades flew by. The next moment, they opened their eyes again. And the moment they opened their eyes, a roar rose into the sky, and a large wave directly penetrated their bodies. Thunder surged in the sky, as if the whole world was roaring. They were still above the sea, but the time was different. Chen Daoming suddenly raised his head. He felt that the scene was very familiar. In an instant, his pupils suddenly dilated and he shouted, "This is the scene decades ago when we were encircling and suppressing the sky-devouring giant beast." The next moment, Lin An saw an extremely huge vortex spinning in the middle of the sea. In the whirlpool, an unimaginably huge beast revealed its head and roared toward the sky. And in all directions of the maelstrom, world-class strong men roared one after another. "We have angered him. Quick! Kai, activate the killing array. Start hunting immediately. Attack, don't hold anything back, try your best, otherwise we will definitely die. Chen Daoming. You four brothers guard the left wing and must not let them break through. Only by killing it can we humans truly take back everything that belongs to us." The battle started, and it was so brutal that the whole sea roared and the sky wept. One after another, the bodies of world-class strong men were broken, but they did not look back. In the distance, young Chen Daoming's face was covered with blood. He roared, constantly breaking open the space, and pulling back one strong person in danger after another. He had a unicorn jade heart on his chest, swaying in the waves. At this moment, the giant beast in the whirlpool suddenly opened its mouth towards him. A stream of water shot towards him at an unimaginable speed. Daoming. Be careful. When he was young, Chen Daoming was overwhelmed, and just when the water column was about to hit him, a figure roared and threw him aside, but the water column still tore his shoulder and scratched his cheek. Luo Chuan, the Chen Daoming roared and grabbed him. "You are crazy." Luo Chuan wiped the blood off his face and said fiercely, "You almost died, and I saved you. Don't complain, none of us four brothers can be left behind. Everything was like a dream." Chen Daoming stared blankly at himself in the distance, and the people standing beside him and fighting side by side with him were the patriarchs of the other three major families: Ling Changfeng, Bailey Xinyuan, and Luo Chuan. At that time, they were as close as brothers, fighting side by side against the same enemy. Now, the world has changed. Lin An came to Chen Dao, took a deep breath, and patted his shoulder. Chen Daoming raised his head, looked at the sky, and said, "He tried his best to save me, but later he tried his best to kill me." Lin En was silent for a long time, and he said, "People will change, and no one can predict a person's future trajectory." Chen Daoming said sadly, "Maybe." Lin En moved his fingers, and the surrounding scenes quickly switched. Lin En adjusted the time to the future for a while. And the next moment, they found themselves on a huge ruins. Instantly, Chen Dao's face changed drastically, and said, What is this? You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. I can see the laws of things. Author, Yitiao Xianyue. Chapter 263. A primitive jungle with no end in sight. Lin En and Chen Daoming stood high in the sky. And just above the ground beneath their feet, there was a huge ruins. All the buildings in that ruins have been damaged and are covered with traces of time. But right in the center of the ruins, there was a huge hole hundreds of meters in diameter. The end of the hole cannot be seen, it is pitch black, it is like a bottomless pit with no idea where it leads. Lin En narrowed his eyes, looked at the black hole, and said, "This should be the place where Emperor Kai first came into contact with the old gods. I can feel the decaying stench of the old gods coming from this black hole." Chen Daoming felt waves of trembling. When you look at the abyss, it seems that the abyss is also staring at you. Makes your heart cold. And right at the edge of the black hole, along with Kai Di, were several scientists and geographers with various detection instruments. Lin En immediately saw that among the group of scientists, there was a man whose face seemed vaguely familiar to him. Could it be Bai Chi's father? Lin En frowned. The man's appearance was not that of a Westerner, but that of an Easterner, and he was 70% similar to Bai Chi. This made Lin En instantly think of what Bai Chi had mentioned to him before about his father's action 20 years ago. She also said that his father obtained the so-called flesh and blood fragments of the old gods from a ruins. Could it be that the action Bai Chi was referring to was this time? Kai Di also participated in this operation. So the current time point should be 20 years ago. The edge of the ruins. Kai Di and the scientists built a small camp, and the sky was already darkening. "Lord Kai, is this the place where you discovered the strange power?" The middle-aged man with an oriental face held a torch and walked up to Kai Di. Emperor Kai was wearing a black robe. He frowned and looked at the ruins and said, "That's right, in the center of this ruins, there is a bottomless black hole. I felt an extremely cold power fluctuation there. This ruins should have only appeared here after the world changed. Bai Zhang, you are all outstanding experts in the world who have the most in-depth research on the many phenomena that occur after the spiritual energy is revived. I brought you here this time because I hope you will work with me to solve the mystery here." He said solemnly, "I vaguely feel that there may be a method hidden in this power that can allow me to break through to the demigods." The middle-aged man named Bai Zhang turned his head and looked deeply at the ruins. He suddenly felt waves of coldness rising from the bottom of his heart, as if something in the darkness was watching them. His heart trembled. "This is definitely not a good place." Bai Zhang said seriously, "Master Kai, we are ready to go at any time, and various detection instruments are also in place." Kai Di nodded and said, "Very good, it will be the night of the full moon soon." The locals living on the outskirts of this primitive forest said that every night of the full moon, there will be changes here. Danger and opportunity coexist. If we can solve the problem, by unraveling the mysteries here, we may be able to find a power that does not belong to our time. He raised the searchlight, looked deeply at the ruins, and said, "Let's go." A group of people walked towards the ruins. Kai Di is a world-class powerhouse, and he can handle any danger that arises. If something happens that even he cannot solve, It proves that the existence here is no longer something that humans at this stage can solve. Above the sky, Lin En and Chen Daoming looked at the group of people with serious eyes. Chen Daoming said solemnly, in this operation, they may have encountered unimaginable changes. Lin En nodded and said, Kaidi was parasitized by the flesh and blood of the old god. Everyone else died except Bai Zhang. Bai Zhang left here with a fragment of the old god. The insect mother in the insect swarm incident was also a derivative. Here. They continued to observe. Through this history, they may actually be able to find some information about the old gods. Time passed by minute by minute. Kai Di and his party also gradually stepped into the depths of this ruins. This is. Finally, they came to the edge of the black hole, and everyone had a look of astonishment on their faces. They directed their searchlights toward the black hole. The light seemed to be swallowed up and could not reach the end of the black hole. Dark, deep, like a big mouth. Bai Zhang took a deep breath, subconsciously took a step back, and said with a shudder, how come there is such a huge cave here? Kaidi looked solemnly towards the black hole and said, this is the source of the power I feel. Can I detect it? Bai Zhang and other scientists immediately assembled the detection instruments they carried on their backs and quickly operated on them. Obviously, they were very well prepared for this operation. We can try it. After the detection equipment was prepared, Bai Zhang took out a metal ball from his backpack. He nodded to Kaidi, frowned, and then pressed a button on the metal ball. The metal ball immediately burst out with dazzling light. Then, Bai Zhang threw the metal ball into the dark abyss. It can be vaguely seen that the metal ball flashed and quickly fell towards the hole. And the images captured by the metal ball quickly appeared on the instruments of Bai Zhang and others. It was obviously a detector. In the image of the detector, everything is normal at present, and there are rock walls all around. The detector is still falling, the depth is 1,642 meters. The detector is very stable, the current depth is 2,142 meters. Every few seconds, they announced the values displayed on the instrument. But as time went by, their faces became more and more solemn. Because the detector still did not reach the end. 54,256 meters. 84,563 meters. 100 kilometers. Bai Zhang raised his head, his face was already a little horrified, he looked at Kaidi standing at the edge of the abyss, and felt dry in his mouth. 100 kilometers, not yet reached the end. This has exceeded the maximum depth that humans have been able to dig so far. Kaidi said solemnly, continue to observe. Time passed by minute by minute. The value on the detector was also constantly soaring. 500 kilometers. 800 kilometers. 1000 kilometers. The detector was still falling, without any obstacles. And 1000 kilometers is already a distance that can span a large state. Everyone subconsciously clenched their fists and looked at the pictures taken by the detector in silence. It was still a rock wall, and the scenery did not change at all. No one knew how deep it was here. Is there really no end here? It was unknown how much time had passed. And just when the value on the instrument reached the terrifying 8,000 kilometers, the scene captured by the detector finally changed. After seeing the scene on the screen, Bai Zhang and others' faces suddenly changed. Lord Kai, come and see. I can see the laws of things. Author, Yi Tiao Xianyue. Chapter 264. Kai Di immediately turned around, came to the instrument, and looked at the screen. Even he felt a chill in his heart. The scene below was no longer the unchanging rock. Instead, it showed a flesh color, like some inflamed and diseased muscle tissue adhered to the stone wall. The deeper they went, the more drastic the change. It was as if they had penetrated deep into some kind of intestine, and the scene presented made people feel a burst of hair on their backs. Gods above Baizhang trembled and said, "What on earth is this? What kind of horrible thing is hidden under this hole?" All of them felt a dry throat. Trembling and uneasiness filled the surroundings. Kai Di frowned. The detector was still falling. Obviously, they only touched the edge of the hole. The real source must be hidden in the deepest part. Time passed by minute by minute. Baizhang raised his head and frowned, saying, "Lord Kai, our detector is about to reach the maximum distance at which we can receive signals. If we continue to go deeper, our connection with the detector will be disconnected. The value on the instrument has reached a terrifying 5,321 kilometers. And the scene in the detector is getting more and more terrifying. The rock wall can no longer be seen around, and all directions are surrounded by diseased tissue." Kai Di looked at the screen of the detector solemnly and clenched his fists. He was waiting. Time passed by minute by minute. Above the sky, the dark clouds gradually dispersed. The pale moon slowly stayed above their heads. Full moon. The pale moonlight hit down without hesitation, dyeing the surroundings into a white frost. And at this moment, a sudden change occurred. What is that? Just when the detector was about to completely lose connection with their instrument, they suddenly saw that the scene on the screen had changed dramatically. Their faces changed drastically in an instant, becoming bloodless. On the flesh wall, one bulge after another slowly opened from the middle. That was eyes. Countless eyes opened on the entire flesh wall. They simply couldn't describe the frenzied scene they saw in words. Countless eyeballs were squeezed together on the flesh walls in all directions. At the same time, snowflakes kept jumping on their screens. The signal had reached its limit and was about to be disconnected. And in the next moment, they actually saw that countless pairs of eyes squeezed together were looking at them at the same time. They faced those countless eyes across the screen. In an instant, they suddenly felt a burst of coldness in their hearts. It was as if those eyes could pass through the detector and see them directly. Everyone's face was pale, they kept retreating, and a huge sense of crisis instantly filled their hearts. And at this moment, from the black hole behind them, there came a burst of obscure whispers that were difficult to describe in words. When they heard those whispers, they immediately felt a burst of tingling in their brains. Ah! A shrill scream was heard. The scientist closest to the black hole suddenly covered his head and screamed. "Help! Help! Kaidi, save me! Something is drilling in my brain. Save me!" Ah! Kaidi and other scientists immediately turned around and looked, and the next moment, their faces turned pale. Tentacles grew out from the back of the scientist's head one after another. His whole body was twisting and struggling constantly. His face was extremely painful. Obviously, at this time, he was still not dead. "What the hell is this?" Baijiang's face was pale, and he sat down on the ground all of a sudden. "Everyone! Back off!" Kaidi shouted. In an instant, he stretched out his hand. Rays of divine light burst out from his hands, instantly crushing the terrible tentacles growing from the back of the scientist's head into pieces. But the next moment, Kaidi's face changed drastically. The fragments of the tentacles that were crushed into powder were constantly fissioning and growing. On the ground near the edge of the abyss, those fragments turned into eyeballs one after another. All the eyeballs looked at them at the same time. And at that moment, they suddenly found that the moonlight had changed. The pale moon in the sky turned into a blood moon at that moment. The scene around them also began to undergo some unimaginable changes. The trees were constantly peeling off, revealing a huge flesh-like body structure. The ground was like burnt ashes, slowly peeling off, and finally turned into the flesh-like structure they saw in the instrument. It seemed that the whole world was in chaos. "Run!" Kaidi turned his head suddenly and yelled at them. The scientists suddenly woke up, screaming in great fear, and ran madly in the direction they came from. None of them knew what happened. The surrounding scene changed under the illumination of the moonlight. The forest turned into countless tentacles, the ground turned into a diseased body, and eyeballs continued to grow on the ground and tentacles. Something is watching them. It is interfering with them. The whole world is in chaos. The detector, which should have been out of range and disconnected from the instrument, is still sending pictures. In the end, the entire screen of the instrument is covered by an eye. It seems that the eyeball can directly pass through the instrument and see the scene here. And only Kaidi is left. Kaidi gritted his teeth, clenched his fists, stood still, and a terrifying power wave burst out from his body. That is world-class power. At this point in time, he is the strongest fighting force of mankind. What are you? His eyes were bloodshot, staring at the body of the scientist who was still growing tentacles. Even at this time, the scientist was still alive and was suffering from great torture. All the eyeballs slowly turned and fell on Kaidi. Some deeper whispers slowly sounded around. It seemed to be a language, and it seemed to be some chaotic noise. But even someone like Kaidi felt a brain-tearing pain when he heard the whisper. And the next moment, the scientist entangled by the tentacles finally died. His forehead suddenly split open, and countless fine tentacles climbed out. His lips slowly opened, and he made an extremely hoarse and intermittent sound. The collapse is inevitable. It cannot be stopped, only change, adapt, transform. In an instant, Kaidi's face changed drastically. In the huge abyss, a black tentacle that reached the sky suddenly climbed out, and the tentacle wrapped around Kaidi's body in an instant at an unimaginable speed. Kaidi roared, and his whole body exploded with billowing flames, trying to break free. But in the abyss, more and more black tentacles grew, wrapping Kaidi layer by layer in his roar. Kaidi roared, but it was useless. In front of those tentacles, the world-class strength was like an ant and had no place to use. The tentacles kept dragging Kaidi toward the abyss, and Kaidi's face changed drastically. He kept struggling, with complete fear on his face. No. No. I can see the laws of things. Author, Yitiao Xianyue. Chapter 265. Above the sky, the expressions of Lin En and Chen Daoming also changed drastically. Because they could clearly feel that Kaidi had pushed his power to the limit. But it still had no effect at all. With a shrill scream, Kaidi was dragged into the huge abyss. And everything around him returned to normal at that moment. The bloody moonlight disappeared, and the forest returned to its original appearance. It was as if nothing had happened. Chen Daoming turned around suddenly, his face turned pale, and said, "What on earth is this? Is this the old god?" Lin En said solemnly, "I'm afraid this is the only explanation." Chen Daoming gritted his teeth and felt a wave of fear in his heart. He said, "Lin En, where is his subsequent memory?" Lin stretched out his hand and waved suddenly, and the whole scene changed quickly. But he actually discovered that all the memories he had later turned to gray. It was as if something had erased his memory. There was a long break in the middle. Lin En narrowed his eyes and said, "After that, there was a gap in his memory, and there was no way to check it." Lin immediately adjusted his memory to the most recent point in time after the ruins incident. Suddenly, the surrounding scene emerged, and they were still in their original position. In that scene, Emperor Kai was walking step by step among the ruins, toward the outside world. He was naked, and behind him was the huge black abyss. But obviously, a very long time must have passed since he was pulled into the abyss. He has returned from the abyss. Lin En and Chen Daoming followed his footsteps and watched him leave the ruins, take a plane, and fly to the British Empire. Along the way, he didn't say a word. The pictures Lin En and Chen Daoming saw were sometimes clear and sometimes disillusioning, just like the pictures on old TV. Lin frowned and said, although he regained consciousness during this period, it is obvious that his consciousness was very chaotic and his memory became distorted. Chen Daoming didn't say anything. He was trembling in his heart. Followed him off the plane. And at the next moment, Chen Daoming's expression changed drastically. That person is. They immediately saw a person greeting the returning Kai Di at the airport. That person was the scientist in the ruins, with countless tentacles growing on his head. The moment he saw that person, Lin immediately realized that something was abnormal. He is actually alive. But is he really still human? Kai Di had almost no communication with the scientist. They boarded the car and returned to the British capital. Lin said solemnly, "Things are getting a little tricky." Lin waved his hand to speed up time, and they quickly watched all Kai Di's experiences afterward. During this period, all the pictures turned into a gray scene like that old TV. In other words, Kai Di's consciousness has been in a half-dream and half-awake state for such a long time. So what is it that controls him? Suddenly, Chen Daoming noticed something. His expression changed and he said, "Lin, back up." Lin immediately turned back time and stopped at a certain point in time. In the picture, Kai Di and the scientist appeared in a remote town in a small country. There is still no communication between the two of them. Dark night. Above the central square, Kai Di and the scientist stood there like corpses. And at the next moment, their bodies suddenly changed. The heads of Kai Di and the scientist suddenly split open, and tentacles grew out of their heads one after another, like blooming flowers, instantly occupying the entire central square. The next moment, countless spore-like flesh and blood fragments shot out from the tentacles and spread throughout the city. This scene caused Chen Daoming's expression to change instantly, and Lin An's eyes became extremely solemn. "What are they doing?" Chen Daoming said tremblingly. Lin couldn't answer, his brows became tighter and tighter. Time moves backwards again. In the following years, they went to one city after another and performed the same operation. They seemed to be spreading something, some unimaginably horrific infection. And in the past few years, the picture they saw was still gray and white. Lin kept moving back in time, and finally at a certain point in time, the picture slowly became normal. Lin frowned. 5 years ago, at this time, Kai Di escaped from the control of that creature. In the screen, Kai Di was in a dark room. He screamed miserably and kept tearing his head apart with his hands, even piercing 10 fingers into his skull. "Leave my body. I will never be controlled by you again. You monsters!" A terrible scream. Kai Di tore open his own head. Chen Daoming's expression changed instantly, because what was flowing out of his head was not blood, but countless tentacles twisted and intertwined in his head. The screen is also constantly flashing between gray and normal. This time lasted for several months. And during these few months, Kai Di has always existed in that twisted form, constantly struggling and self-harming. Finally, after a few months, the picture returned to normal. The countless tentacles twisted and crawled into Kai Di's body, and the wounds healed. Kai Di struggled to stand up, his eyes were red, he punched the room with a roar, looked at the sky, and said, "Old God! No one can control me. I will become your biggest enemy, and I will completely wipe out your era. I am the king of this era, you old reptiles can't even think of infiltrating my world. Ah!" He roared and shattered the sky with one punch. By this time, he had apparently regained human consciousness. He realized his position and began to control the British Empire, constantly launching wars against small countries in the world, annexing them, and controlling them. At the same time, he continued to send out troops to destroy the cities he had visited and where the spores had spread. Massacre. Kill everyone. This lasted until a few months before the fight with Lin. And at that moment, Lin An's pupils suddenly shrank, and he saw a very familiar figure. Bai Qi. That's right. It was Bai Qi. At that time, she should have just left Kyushu territory and went abroad. How could she appear in Kaidi's memory? Lin immediately adjusted to that point in time. In the screen, Baichi appeared in a remote city. She was sitting on a chair, frowning at the document in her hand. And Kaidi is using his mental power to observe her. The next moment, he directly broke through the space and appeared in the room where she was. Baichi's expression changed instantly. She immediately stood up, stared at him, and said, "Who are you?" Kaidi, dressed in black robe, looked at her deeply and said, "I don't have any ill intentions, Baichi, Baijiang's daughter. I know you are investigating the old gods." Baichi warned, "Who are you, and how do you know about the old gods?" Kaidi said deeply, "I once explored that ruins with your father. I was one of the participants in that operation. You don't need to know who I am. You just need to know that I have nothing to do with you malice, because you are the only human being in this world, besides me, who has the genes of the old gods in his body and has not yet been controlled. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. I can see the laws of things. Author, Yitiao Xianyue. Chapter 266. Baichi frowned and subconsciously took a step back. She stared at Kaidi and said, "What do you want from me?" Kaidi said deeply, "There is something I must tell you. I was once controlled by the old gods, and under their control, I spread the genes of the old gods to one city after another around the world. Although now I cannot predict the harm those seeds will do to humans in the future, but I can imagine that given the evil intentions of the old gods towards us humans, once those seeds sprout, the consequences will be unimaginable." Baichi's expression suddenly changed and she said, "Spreading the genes of the old gods in human society." Kaidi narrowed his eyes and said, "Yes, I have been destroying those infected bodies as much as possible, but they have probably spread long ago. I can't use the power of the old gods too much, otherwise I may be killed again. You are controlled by them, so I can only come to you. Because you are the only human being who has the genes of the old gods in your body and is immune to the control of the old gods." He slowly stretched out his hand and placed a small crystal element in his palm. Baichi frowned and said, "What is this?" Kaidi said deeply, "This is all the information I have investigated on the old gods in the past few years, as well as the tracking reports of most of the people who have been infected with the seeds. I hope to hire you and let you investigate more deeply. And knowing the old god, I hope to find all those who have been infected with the seed through you." He raised his head, narrowed his eyes suddenly, and said, "Then, kill them." A few hours later, over the Eastern Sea, Lin En and Chen Daoming slowly opened their eyes. They have gone through all Kaidi's memories. Chen Daoming took a deep breath, and there was a haze between his eyebrows. "I can't imagine that there are such terrifying creatures hiding in our world, so terrifying that even people like Kaidi have become puppets." Lin En raised his head and said indifferently, "He has always regarded himself as the king of men. If the old gods are not good to humans, he thinks that the old gods are violating his interests. But from the perspective of humans, he can indeed assume this position." Chen Daoming turned around and looked at Lin En's side face and said, "Do you regret killing him?" Lin En said indifferently, "The winner is the king and the loser is the enemy. His power is too weak. Even the old gods can't fight against him. If humanity is handed over to his hands, it will only be annihilated in the end. But I am stronger than him and I can do it. He couldn't do it." Chen Daoming asked, "What are your plans next?" Lin En raised his head and said, "I want to go to Baichi first. She holds most of the information about the old gods, as well as those so-called people infected with the genes of the old gods. These need to be dealt with step by step." Chen Daoming frowned and said, if if those people who are infected with the genes of the old gods will also become those monsters, how should we deal with them? Lin was silent. After a long while, he raised his head and said, I will try my best to find a way to cure them, but if it is irreversible. Lin An said slowly, I can only go to that extreme like Kai did. Lin An said goodbye to Chen Daoming, and then immediately headed towards the place where Bai Qi was detained in Kai Di's memory. The reason why Bai Qi didn't contact her for such a long time was because she was coerced by Kai Di. According to the information obtained, Bai Qi was detained in a secret research site of Kai Di on the African continent in the west. That continent has always been on the edge of the center of the world, and after the spiritual energy was revived, that continent was completely reduced to a bad land. Even now, the humans on that continent have not completely cleared out the ferocious beasts. And the ruins of the old gods are also on that continent. Lin An raised his head, looked at the approaching continent, squinted his eyes, and said, Old God. It was almost late at night. The continent of West Africa, located underground in a city on the western coast. Haven't you heard the news from the outside? Master Kai is dead. He was killed by the strongman named Lin An from the east. So what is the use of studying these disgusting things now? In the hall, a man in chemical protective clothing roared, threw the gas mask on his head to the ground, and crushed it to pieces. The hall was filled with various instruments. One after another, people wearing chemical protective suits leaned against the edge of the instruments, frowning. It has been exactly 5 hours since the news of Kai Di's death. Everyone in the entire base had to consider their own options. This military base located underground in the city was secretly built by Kai Di several years ago. Most of them are scientists from various fields that Kai Di has recruited from all over the world. They were assigned to study an ancient life form. Except for a few who came voluntarily, most of the scientists were coerced by Kai Di in various ways. They basically completely cut off contact with the outside world and were unable to contact their families for several years. A middle-aged man wearing glasses frowned and said, What's the use of complaining? We don't have weapons, how can we fight with the soldiers outside? Even if we have weapons, do you think we have the strength to fight against those elite British soldiers? People in the hall couldn't argue, and a quarrel even broke out. While everyone was arguing, there was only one person who sat in front of the computer in the corner from beginning to end, operating the instrument with her fingers. She had black hair, a pair of black framed glasses on her face, and a serious face. At this moment, she was looking at the screen solemnly. Bai Qi. She was Bai Qi who had been missing for several months. At this moment, the computer screen was showing the surveillance picture. The scene in the picture was in various closed test sites. In the picture, 2 soldiers wearing chemical protective suits were patrolling. In the center of the laboratory, there was a huge glass instrument with an unknown solution in the instrument, and a twisted humanoid organism was soaked in the solution. The reason why it was a humanoid organism was that below his neck was a human body, but above his neck were thick black tentacles, which looked particularly scary. Bai Qi was separating and observing the cell samples of that organism. At this moment, suddenly, Bai Qi caught a tremor in the corner of her eye. This immediately caught Bai Qi's attention. The organism was a sample brought back by the military from the base through a secret channel. Logically speaking, the sample had no signs of life and was soaked in a concentrated acid solution, which prevented the spread of infection and could be said to be absolutely safe. But the sudden tremor just now still made Bai Qi frown. She slowly pointed the surveillance camera at the organism and said, Number 14, number 532, report the situation of the laboratory in Area B. I can see the laws of things. Author, Yi Tiao Xianyue. Chapter 267. Everything is fine. The 2 soldiers replied on the phone. But Bai Qi still felt a wave of uneasiness in her heart. She slowly zoomed in the camera's screen and slowly enlarged the sample. As the screen zoomed in, the twisted organism appeared more clearly in front of her. She could even clearly see the fine lines on the twisted tentacles of the organism. Zoom in. Zoom in. It seemed as if something was attracting her to keep the screen closer. Until the roots of the tentacles. And at this moment, in the center of the blooming tentacles, a vertical eye suddenly opened. The vertical eye stared straight at the screen. Bai Qi was startled and her face turned pale instantly. She almost immediately pressed the alarm and quickly zoomed out of the screen. The shrill alarm instantly rang throughout the base. She immediately stood up and said to the computer anxiously, "Laboratory in Area B, alert immediately. The sample has an abnormal reaction, immediately." But before she finished her words, on the surveillance screen, a tentacle suddenly broke through the glass instrument and instantly pierced a soldier's throat. A shrill scream came instantly. The next moment, the screen went black, and all the instruments in the entire hall flashed at that moment. The glaring red alarm and the darkness brought by the power outage instantly changed the faces of everyone present. What happened? What's going on? In the hall, the arguing researchers looked around in horror. Bai Qi frowned, he turned his head suddenly, and quickly came to the communication equipment, his fingers crackling on it, and soon there was an intermittent sound from the other side of the equipment. "Information Department, the experimental base has been disturbed, report the situation immediately." An anxious voice came from the other side of the communication equipment. "Report, 10 seconds ago, our network was suddenly invaded and interfered by an unknown intrusion. We are investigating, and the military has sent people to." "What is that?" "No. No. What is that?" A terrified voice came from the other side immediately, as if seeing some terrible scene. Bai Qi said anxiously, "Hello. Hello." And the next moment, a shrill scream came from the other side. Along with the scream, there was also some kind of indescribable hoarse whisper. Bai Qi hung up the phone suddenly, and his face turned pale instantly. Everyone in the hall heard the shrill scream. They looked at Bai Qi and said in horror, "What's going on? What happened?" "Team leader Bai Qi." Bai Qi raised his head suddenly, his eyes were full of bloodshot, and said, "Quick! Evacuate immediately, the old god, it's the old god, it's coming." As soon as these words came out, the faces of everyone around him changed instantly. "What did you say?" Bai Qi was trembling all over. She stretched out her hand to cover her temple and gritted her teeth. "I heard that whisper. They are approaching. They are approaching us. All the samples in the entire base have been awakened by the old gods. It is coming." Bai Qi almost trembled to the extreme with the last few words. And just at the moment when she said that, the surrounding screens flashed violently. The next moment, all the screens had black vertical eyes. Everyone in the hall screamed. Bai Qi suddenly stretched out her hand, opened the door, and gritted her teeth. "Quick! We must leave here immediately. Otherwise, all of us will die." As she said that, she rushed out first. On the corridor outside, one soldier after another ran towards the depths of the base. The samples in the laboratory at the bottom had all awakened, and a large-scale containment failure had been triggered. Bai Qi gritted her teeth and moved quickly along the corridor. She knew that if those soldiers went underground, the final result would only be death. Because the old gods are coming. She knew the reason, and Kaidi told him everything. When he was alive, he could use the power of the old gods to shield the old gods' perception in a specific area, so they were able to build this huge base under the eyes of the old gods. But now that Kaidi is dead, they will be exposed to the old gods' perspective without any cover. Because the old gods are a collective whole. They are like insect mothers, able to control all the old gods' genes. Once they think it is necessary, they can immediately descend and invade. After her research on the old gods' information left by Kaidi, she found that since the old gods awakened from the spiritual revival period 100 years ago, its power has been accumulating. In her mind, a series of pictures of the black hole taken in recent years quickly emerged. Compared with 20 years ago, the current black hole has expanded to almost the size of a small city. Everything is foreshadowing that the old god's influence on this world is increasing. Bai Qi gritted her teeth and ran quickly to the ground. The old gods are coming. Must leave here. Must leave. And the next moment, Bai Qi suddenly broke open the tightly closed gate of the base and rushed out. The cold air of the night rolled in. On the square, there were mobilized soldiers everywhere. Because of the alarm, all the soldiers were awakened from their sleep. At this moment, Bai Qi stood there in a daze, and then knelt on the ground. She raised her head and looked at the sky. The moon. Today is a full moon. It was exactly the same as what she saw in the information given to her by Kaidi. The moon, hanging high in the sky. Bai Qi murmured, "No. No. No." Buzz. A sound like the harsh sound waves from the broken strings, and like the hoarse noise in the old TV. At that moment, all the soldiers covered their ears and fell to the ground miserably. At that moment, the moon in the sky slowly turned into a scarlet. The bloody moonlight fell on the ground. Bai Qi stood up tremblingly, and she felt the sense of being watched. She felt that something was watching her soul. A hoarse whisper slowly came to her ears. "You are a fusion masterpiece. You belong to us." Bai Qi trembled and stepped back, shaking her head constantly, saying in fear, "No. No." She turned around suddenly, covered her ears, and stumbled out of the base. But she felt it. Something was approaching her. Step by step. It was like the sound of war drums, accompanied by a sticky and cold touch, approaching her little by little. There was an invisible figure, something that could not be seen with the naked eye, approaching. I can see the laws of things. Author, Yitiao Xianyue. Chapter 268. Plop. She tripped and fell heavily to the ground. She turned her head and her pupils suddenly shrank, revealing great fear in her eyes. The one who tripped her was a soldier's body. But at this moment, one tiny tentacles after another were slowly crawling out of the eyes of the corpse. Bai Qi screamed and kept moving backwards. She saw a boarder approaching her. All the soldiers covered by the boarder screamed miserably in an instant, and twisted tentacles grew wildly on their bodies. The wall kept peeling off, revealing the bloody flesh wall, and one vertical eye after another climbed on the wall. The sky was scarlet. It seemed that the whole world was in chaos. Finally, she had no way to retreat. "No. Don't come over." Bai Qi looked at the approaching boarder in horror, and she suddenly stretched out her hand and pressed it on her chest. That was her life wheel. That was the only power she could control. The power of collapse, using this terrible power, and at the cost of life, causing absolute extinction within hundreds of kilometers. But at this moment, she heard the hoarse whisper again in her ears. "Your power comes from us. You want to use this power to fight against us. It's useless. You belong to us." And at that moment, a dark tentacle suddenly burst out from the dark border. The tentacle was so fast that it even tore the space directly. In Bai Qi's pupils, the dark tentacle continued to expand, and perhaps in the next second, her body would be pierced. "No," she screamed and closed her eyes, and her palm suddenly pressed against the life wheel on her chest. But the expected severe pain did not appear. At the moment when she was about to start her life wheel, she felt a strong hand grabbing her wrist, preventing her from going any further. That hand made her very familiar, so familiar that it appeared in her dreams day and night. She opened her eyes tremblingly, and at that moment, she was stunned. At some point, a tall figure appeared in front of her. The whistling wind blew up his hair, and she could barely see his profile. On that cold face, a pair of purple eyes exuded a terrifying light. Lin En. She said blankly. Lin En said slowly, do you think that after Kaidi was killed by me, no one will come to trouble you? Lin En raised his head expressionlessly, and a dazzling light burst out from his purple eyes. He grabbed the tentacle that burst out and said, no, I will only be more cruel to you. Crack. Lin En directly crushed the tentacle in his hand into minced meat, and he suddenly stretched out his hand towards the border of nothingness, and the rolling wind blew up his robe. In an instant, thunder and lightning surged. The next moment, a bloody electric current spread out along the tentacle that Lin En was holding towards the border. A huge electric current sounded, and an angry roar came from the border of nothingness. Bai Qi stared at the scene blankly. The old god was injured. And the next moment, countless dark tentacles suddenly burst out from the border of nothingness, and each tentacle quickly split into dense tentacles during flight. In a flash, the whole sky was wrapped by the tentacles. It came overwhelmingly with unstoppable power. Bai Qi hurriedly said, be careful. Lin En said nothing, his eyes were indifferent, and the next moment, a silver-white space wheel appeared in his eyes. Broken. With a click. At the moment he said those two words, in Bai Qi's shocked eyes, countless cracks appeared above the entire base at that moment, as if a sledgehammer hit the glass heavily. With a loud bang. The whole sky was broken. The countless tentacles also quickly disappeared in the space turbulence along with the broken space. A shrill and extremely sharp scream came from the border of nothingness. Obviously, the creatures in that border were also severely damaged. But obviously, Lin En would not give him any chance. He shouted, come here. In an instant, he pulled towards the border of nothingness out of thin air. A terrible scene appeared. The whole space was directly approaching his direction in his pull, the ground in the middle was squeezed towards the ground, and the space within a radius of hundreds of kilometers was pulled over by him. At the moment when the space was pulled over, Lin En stretched out his fist and punched the border of nothingness heavily. Boom! The border line was directly destroyed. The whole illusion was shattered with a bang. Countless black blood slowly flowed out from the damaged border. The shrill screams resounded through the sky. Along with that scream, the red moon in the sky slowly returned to normal, and the border of nothingness gradually disappeared, leaving only the black blood flowing on the ground and the twisted corpses. Bai Qi stared at the scene blankly. She couldn't believe that the old god was actually driven away. In her impression, the power of the old god is almost unmatched. As long as it appears, it will inevitably bring gloomy fear and endless killing. This is the first time she has seen the old god in such a miserable state. Lin En turned his head and looked at her, saying, Bai Qi, long time no see. Bai Qi stared at his cheek blankly. They hadn't seen each other for more than half a year, but it seemed like they were separated by countless years. She still remembered that during the Zerg incident, she and Lin Zheng took him to escape. In just less than a year, he has grown to the point where the whole world has to look up to him. Lin En. I finally see you. Bai Qi cried and hugged Lin En's chest tightly, trembling all over. Lin En patted her back, hoping to bring her a little comfort. Scientists and soldiers came out of the base one after another. They looked at the terrible scene outside and the flowing black blood, terrified and shocked. In the base, the situation was out of control, but just as those twisted monsters were about to break through their defenses, all of a sudden, all the monsters lost control and screamed, and quickly lost their combat effectiveness. And the next moment, they saw the man that Bai Qi was crying and hugging on the other side of the base. Instantly, their faces showed even more terrified expressions. That's Lin En. If their fear of the old gods was the fear of the unknown, then for Lin En, they were afraid from the bottom of their hearts, because he was a man who could kill even Kaidi and made the old gods flee in fear. His existence was the real terror. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. I Can See the Laws of Things. Author, Yitiao Xianyue. Chapter 269. In the base, the surviving scientists and soldiers looked at Lin An with a strong fear in their eyes. They were trembling all over, worrying that Lin An would come over and take their lives. What should I do? I don't want to die. If Lin An wants to kill us, we will definitely not be able to escape. But Lin An didn't pay attention to these people. He just looked at Bai Qi, who was crying and trembling in his arms, with his purple eyes. His brows wrinkled slightly unconsciously. The escape of the old god just now completely sounded the alarm in Lin An's heart. Solving the danger of the old god is urgent. He asked Bai Qi with a serious tone. Bai Qi, tell me everything you know during this period. Bai Qi, who was crying and trembling in Lin An's arms, had adjusted her state at this moment. The trembling body stopped trembling, and the tears stopped flowing. She raised her head and met Lin An's eyes. On her cheeks, there were still 2 lines of undried tears, which made people feel pity in their hearts. But Lin An didn't have any special feelings. He just looked at Bai Qi seriously, waiting for Bai Qi's answer. Bai Qi was subconsciously stunned when she saw Lin An's appearance, but since she had been with Lin An for a while, she understood what the most important thing was now. Bai Qi quickly organized her words and started to talk. Since the old gods appeared in this world decades ago, they have secretly controlled many people who have come into contact with them. For so many years, the old gods have controlled these people, constantly traveling around the world, madly spreading the old god genes contained in them. The bodies and souls of many people have actually completely belonged to the old gods. It's just that they are hidden in this world and have not been discovered by people. And the bodies and souls of those infected by the old god genes will be distorted by the old god genes. They will grow many tentacles on their bodies, which is no different from monsters. When Bai Qi told the news she knew, her eyes revealed an unconcealable fear. Even her tone began to tremble. But every time she felt the power of transmission from Lin An, who was tightly hugged by her, her frightened heart would instantly calm down and no longer feel any fear. She looked into Lin An's eyes, and her face became ruddy uncontrollably. The feeling of being held in Lin An's arms. It's so wonderful. While listening to Bai Qi's story, Lin An was still thinking in his heart. Although he got some information about the old gods through the memory in Kaidi's soul. But he was not very clear about many other things. Hearing Bai Qi's words, Lin An felt more and more that the world was in a very dangerous situation. He asked Bai Qi, "Is there any other information?" The moment she heard Lin An's words, Bai Qi, who was immersed in this gentle place, turned around suddenly. She remembered the important information placed in the laboratory. She quickly looked at Lin An and continued. In the research base, there is a group of photos of the remains of the old gods. You will understand if you go into the base with me. Duh. 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 After speaking, Bai Qi reluctantly broke away from Lin An's arms and walked towards the base. Lin An followed Bai Qi and walked into the research base. The research base at this time had been destroyed by the appearance of the old god just now. After Bai Qi entered the base, she walked directly to a display screen that was still lit. After she operated it, 2 clear forest photos were projected on the display screen. However, one of them had only a black dot the size of a bean, while the other had a black hole the size of a wash basin. Bai Qi looked at the 2 photos, and waves of fear appeared in her pupils. She turned around, looked at Lin An, pointed at the 2 photos, and slowly said, "These 2 photos were taken by satellite, both of which are the forest where the old gods' ruins are located." One was taken decades ago when the old god was just discovered, and the other was taken recently. Lin An's purple eyes stared at the two photos closely. Just by looking at these two photos, he could feel the evil and coldness that belonged to the old god from these two photos. Therefore, his brows couldn't help but frown even tighter, and a chill flashed across his purple pupils. Bai Qi, what is the black thing in this photo? Lin An asked. Bai Qi immediately replied. Black hole. The black in these two photos is the same black hole. In the past few decades, it has expanded countless times. Looking at the black holes above the two photos, which were at least 100 times different in size, Lin made a decision in his heart in an instant. He wants to go to the place where the ruins of the old god are and stop the expansion of this black hole. If we continue like this and leave this black hole alone, then one day this black hole will completely swallow up the entire world. Lin An thought of this terrible possibility in his heart, and a strong murderous intention emerged in his heart. He withdrew his gaze from the two photos. After blinking his purple eyes, he looked at Bai Qi and said, I want to go to this ruins now. Bai Qi was not surprised at all when she heard Lin An's decision. Judging from her understanding of Lin, she had already expected Lin to make such a decision. But the way she looked at Lin An was full of fascination. Lin, he's the same as before, nothing has changed. Still so brave, and so powerful. Can I go with you? Bai Qi asked. Lin An shook his head and replied. Just stay here. After the old gods were scared off by me, they won't come here again for a while. He had no intention of taking Bai Qi to the ruins with him, because this must be a very dangerous trip. After answering Bai Qi's question, strong wind suddenly blew up beside Lin An. The clothes he was wearing were rustled by the strong winds. Some information in the base is flying all over the sky. The scientists and soldiers who were huddled on the ground, shivering, felt the sharp wind that could cut their skin, and the frequency of their bodies shaking became faster. I can see the laws of things. Author, Yi Tiao Xianyue. Chapter 270. Boom. And Lin An's figure, at the moment when the strong wind blew, accumulated strength and took a heavy step forward. The huge noise made the scientists and soldiers feel suffocated, and even their eardrums were almost pierced. They begged for mercy in fear. Help, help. Lin An, Lord Lin An, don't kill me. I was forced by that bastard Kaidi. And a few seconds later, when the strong wind stopped, Lin An's figure had disappeared. The tense hearts of the scientists and soldiers were finally relaxed. They all stood up from the somewhat broken ground with lingering fear, looking at the place where Lin An was just now with fear in their eyes. The soldiers who were stronger than ordinary people were slapping their chests hard and breathing in fresh air in big gulps. They looked at each other, and they all saw deep fear in them. Lin An's strength is really strong. Just taking a step forward, my eardrum almost burst. Too scary, even when facing Kaidi, I have never seen such a sense of oppression. Facing Lord Lin An is like facing God. And just a few minutes later, Lin An had arrived at the forest where the ruins of the old gods were located. Along the way, he constantly used the will of space to cross space, and also used the will of acceleration to increase his speed. That's why he came to the place where the ruins of the old gods were located in such a short time. As for the location of the ruins of the old gods, he already knew it when he saw the memory in Kaidi's soul. Floating in the air, Lin An looked at the forest under his feet. At this moment, this forest no longer looked like a forest. In the center of the forest, there was a bottomless black hole with an area of tens of thousands of square meters, and the black hole was still expanding. It expanded a little more in just a few seconds after Lin An came here. Lin An's body was falling rapidly. When his feet touched the ground again, the entrance to the forest appeared in front of him. At this time, he could see the forest clearly. There was no green in the forest. Everything that entered Lin An's field of vision was full of strange and evil colors. The originally green trees and flowers were now twisted into tentacles, and the color was pure black. The cold evil breath was constantly emanating from the tentacles twisted into trees and weeds. Even the ground connected to the black hole turned dark red, and the texture was no longer land, but more like a thick layer of flesh and blood. Duh! Lin An took a step forward and calmly entered the forest ruled by the old gods. When his feet landed on the dark red ground, he felt a sticky and disgusting touch. At the same time, vertical eyes suddenly appeared on the tentacles that were twisted by the trees, flowers, and plants beside him. Endless evil feelings emanated from these countless vertical eyes, and instantly devoured Lin An, as if to pull Lin An into a bottomless abyss. Tentacles spread out from the ground, waving and stabbing at Lin An. These countless tentacles that covered the sky and the earth approached Lin An at an extremely fast speed. Lin An raised his head, his face was extremely indifferent, and a pair of purple eyes were shining with terrible light. Lin An said in a cold tone, "Humph! Old God, is this your welcome ceremony for me?" After saying this, Lin An raised a hand to the top, with 5 fingers open and aimed at the countless tentacles that were bombarding from the sky. At the same time, he shook his head slowly, and said with a mocking tone, "That has to be said. Your welcome ceremony. It's a bit too simple." And the next moment, these countless tentacles touched the hand raised by Lin An. Boom! Instantly, several scarlet electric currents burst out from Lin An's palm. The countless tentacles blocking Lin An's palm suddenly stopped at this moment. The next moment, countless tentacles quickly began to flee to the back. The tentacles with weak intelligence felt an irresistible huge pressure on Lin An's palm. It was as if they were facing their natural enemy in this world. But it was useless. The speed of these countless tentacles could not be compared with the speed of the lightning in Lin An's palm. In the blink of an eye, they were all broken and turned into debris that was much smaller than dust. Boom! Boom! The space collapsed at the place where the scarlet lightning destroyed the tentacles, and black void cracks filled the low sky. A powerful force of attraction emanated from the gap, destroying everything around it. The tentacles of the old god that were standing beside Lin An began to flee at this moment. They were fleeing from Lin An like crazy. Under the survival instinct of their weak intelligence, they just wanted to survive. Rumble! 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 At this moment, a huge thundercloud gathered in the sky in an instant. The area of the thundercloud was so large that it seemed to occupy the entire sky. Scarlet lightning was circling in the thundercloud, constantly striking down towards the black forest below. In this forest, the tentacles covered by the thundercloud began to wriggle. They were desperately fleeing from all the places that the scarlet lightning might touch. Once struck by the scarlet lightning, what awaited them was only complete destruction. At the same time, the scarlet lightning that struck down was as violent as a waterfall pouring down from the sky, completely destroying everything it touched. The tentacles twisted by the spores of the old gods had no resistance under the thunder and lightning, and were easily destroyed, as fragile as a piece of paper. On the ground that had become a flesh wall, huge black holes appeared, and waves of burning smells spread out of the caves. After countless lightning strikes, the thunderclouds dissipated. And this forest has now become a purgatory on earth. On the ground, there are huge deep pits everywhere, all around the black hole. A tree, no, it should be said that even a weed, can no longer be seen. The original forest was destroyed by the bombardment of thunder and lightning and became a wasteland. All that is left is the huge black hole that is still spreading.